Hello, boys and girls. Once again, it's Mr. Raine. To my right here is Mr.
Suter.
This is the Lesson 8. Why did the Bolsheviks win the Russian Civil War? So to recap, and where we left off last lesson, the war looks something like this. You have the Reds completely surrounded. The Reds are the Bolsheviks, and their Red Army are completely surrounded on all sides by various groups, the Whites, Greens, and foreign powers, all vying to overthrow the Bolsheviks, topple the revolution, and stop Lenin and Trotsky and the like from taking power.
Remember that map, because we'll be talking a lot about this geographical shape, the fact that Russia is in the center where all the cities are, and also how divided the Whites are. So what we're going to do is go through all the main reasons why the Reds ultimately win this civil war. So to start with, and I would say one of the most important points was a lack of unity of the Whites. There are three major White generals, each had their own army. We have Kolchak in the east, who had 140,000 men, who was eventually pushed back in autumn 1918. Yudenich in the west near Estonia with 15,000 men, who got as close to St. Petersburg as it was as Petrograd by October 1919 before being pushed back. And Denikin in the south with 150,000 men, who, although he was temporarily slowed at Tsaritsyn, a city which was renamed after the hero who saved the Reds at this point to the legendary Stalingrad, as we shall call it. In summer 1918, they pushed forward before being pushed back again in 1919. These three generals all hated the Bolsheviks. They were all from upper-class, conservative backgrounds who would like nothing else but to see socialism crushed and go back to the sort of age before the Tsar. However, they refused to cooperate or coordinate. They were a rival because they didn't want someone to take all the credit for a victory that they hard helped in. And more than that, they disagreed about what the government would look like, and more importantly, who would be in charge, or at least important, if and when the Whites win. So what we have is three large armies led by professional soldiers, by experienced officers, supplied by the foreign powers, loads and loads of resources, but who are too broken up to actually attack at the same time. And there's almost no doubt that if the Whites had got their act together and attacked at the same time, the Bolsheviks, particularly in the early years, would not have been able to fight it up. But the fact that they are divided means that Trotsky, as we shall see, can move his troops around, step by step, one by one, to take out each of the generals by turn, because he'll concentrate, that means gather all his Red Army soldiers together and send them to the east, defeat one, then send them to the west. If the White generals were attacking at the same time, Trotsky couldn't possibly do this. But the fact that they are divided means that Trotsky can take advantage of this to some extent.
Another massive weakness of the Whites is the fact that they don't have domestic support. By domestic support, we mean amongst the Russian people. The Whites are very popular with the middle and upper classes, and especially amongst the right. These people generally tend to be right-wing and conservatives of the political spectrum. Now, if you think back even to our earlier lessons, Russia is primarily made up of peasants, and the Whites don't necessarily have the support of the peasants. The peasants don't necessarily want to see another authoritarian form of government to come in. They don't necessarily want to see the Bolsheviks either, but they don't want a return of the Tsar. These guys find it hard, as a result, to make poor peasants and workers fight for them. And these people are essential since they comprise the bulk of the hundreds of thousands of soldiers that they command. The Whites could have tried to make policies, they could have tried to make reforms, and they could have tried to make proclamations to the people and to the masses that would make them want to fight for a new type of Russia. But really, these people were old school. They were too conservative. They wanted Russia to go back to the way it was, and weren't willing to give concessions that would have endeared them to these people and bring them support. These people, they even refused to allow nationalists to push for separation, despite the fact that they were key potential allies. So these people not only didn't want to give the Russian peasants anything. They had the allies in the Greens who they could work with, but they refused to allow them independence afterwards, even though that could have saved Russia. And as such, the Greens wouldn't really work with them either. They didn't fight against them nominally, but they didn't coordinate and work together. And as Mr. Suter said, their lack of coordination is vital. Only the Cossacks, an old breed of horse-mounted soldiers, particularly from the southern regions of Russia, were the only real reliable soldiers. And once the whites had pushed the red out of Cossack homeland, these people didn't really care to keep on fighting. But they didn't. When they did, they tended to basically loot, rape, and pillage the local non-Cossacks, thus making the whites more enemies amongst the people. So even their most loyal soldiers, in a sense, were a detriment. Denikin helped landowners get their old estates back at the expense of the peasantry, and all told, what you really have are people turning off the whites' armies. Not to mention the fact that they imposed harsh military discipline as a way to keep order, which is no way to get the control and to endear yourself to people who are sort of skeptical about your motives to begin with. This led to lots of retreats, them giving up, and many, many thousands of people on the white side deserting and running away from the army. The officers were promoted not by how well they led, how popular they were amongst their troops, but they were promoted based on wealth and personal status. So oftentimes that the people leading the soldiers were unable to get their buy-in, but also the fact that they were second rate.
And a key part of this is, and in any civil war, you need two things. You need soldiers to fight, and you need reliable resources. If no one wants to join your army and fight for your army reliably because you stand for everything they're against, i.e., if the Reds win, you're a poor peasant, you get some nice land. If the Whites win, then that land that you had taken from the old landlord will be given back to your landlord. Why would you fight for the Whites, therefore? And also, you need those reliable resources. But if the peasants hate you because your Cossacks have looted and raped, or you try to take their land from them, they aren't going to help you. You are not going to get those supplies. On top of this, we see that the foreign powers stop and reduce their help for the whites. Although they gave supplies, they refused to put more soldiers, which could probably tip the balance. Remember that the Reds and the Whites are fighting with very poorly equipped, poorly trained, poorly motivated armies. A well-equipped, experienced army, particularly as after World War I finished, could have easily been decisive. But because no one in France, Britain or the United States really wanted to get involved in another war, they didn't send the soldiers. Although they sent lots of supplies, as time went on, it became increasingly clear that the officers of the whites, the people in charge, were just selling the goods that was meant to be going to the soldiers for personal profit. There's many stories, for example, how the Reds were equipped in British Army uniforms, which was actually meant to be given to the white soldiers, but the officers along the way had actually sold them to their enemies to make a bit of profit, which is probably as corrupt as you can get to some extent. And there's other stuff like nurses' uniforms we won't go into. And eventually, an evidence of this corruption and the fact that the whites were too disorganized and too unpopular to get anything done meant that the foreign powers start to give up. What's the point of giving these supplies? They're only going to be sold for profit anyway, and even if they get to the front line, they're not going to win the war. The whites are increasingly looking like they're not going to win the war. Why waste money on this? And we see the amount of supplies reducing over time.
So that leads us then, so if the whites were weak, what made the Bolsheviks strong? What relatively small group compared to the whites? The key one is geography. If you look at that map, it's incredibly important. You see that in the middle, they're completely surrounded. And when people think of the term surrounded, they generally think, oh, that's a bad thing to be surrounded. Not necessarily in this case. The fact that the Bolsheviks controlled the central area meant it was easier to move troops around. Now, if you were a white soldier or a white general and you wanted to move troops all the way around to the other side, you'd have to go around a huge swathe of land. For the Bolsheviks, they could, with the railways, which were highly concentrated in the fact that they controlled the two major cities, Petrograd and Moscow, the fact that they could use the railways to get troops to wherever they needed to be quickly and efficiently and without having to cross giant tracts of land and without having to cross territories controlled by the other side. It was easier to pass messages and coordinate your troops, unlike the whites who were uncoordinated, and also the fact that they had the major cities, and thus they had control over the industry, particularly armament factories, the bombs and the guns and the the tank factories that were essential to winning a war. These factories existed in the major cities. And when you look at that map, you see that who controls the biggest cities? It's the Bolsheviks with their central position. This also means that they have more of a population draw in. The fact that Moscow and Petrograd are your two biggest cities, and they're both controlled by the Reds, means that they can draw on the huge population of the people living in those cities to support and to fill the ranks of their armies.
As we've already mentioned before, civil wars and wars are won by sheer amounts of resources and the ability to put soldiers where they're needed. And the geographical factors are very much the Bolshevik side. They own all the factories to build the weapons, and more importantly, they can, if there's an attack on the east, they can move very quickly across the rail network soldiers to deal with that. And they can then move the soldiers back very quickly to another threat. They're able, therefore, to somewhat mount an effective defense. Another point of strength is they were relatively united and relatively more popular than the whites. That is not a hard thing. The whites, remember, stand for almost the czarist hierarchy coming back. If you were a peasant and you had a terrible life in that hierarchy, then obviously you don't really want the whites back. And despite the fact that there is problems of discipline and many soldiers don't want to be there, the masses broadly would support the Reds more than the whites, which means that on balance, if you are a soldier fighting for the Reds, you have more of a reason to fight because you believe in it a little bit than if you were the same soldier fighting for the Reds. And this makes a huge difference because most battles are not won by everyone being killed. You very rarely have massive casualties above 20, 30, 40% of a unit. What makes battles lost is if people run away. And if you are fighting over a side you don't believe in, you are far more likely to run away. Why risk your life and die for a cause you don't believe in? So because the Reds offer the best chance to protect your rights that you've got as workers and peasants. For example, it's not helped by the fact that the whites say that any land that they take will be given back to landowners rather than the peasants who have taken it. Because they offer the best chance, they naturally get the support of the workers and peasants. Yes, there are still problems, but the Bolsheviks promised more to the masses, and the masses are what matters, because they are the ones who are working for the food, they are working in the factories to make the guns, and more importantly, they are fighting on the front line. And they will stay in the field and they will fight more because at least it's something they sort of believe in. Even if they aren't personally Bolsheviks, it's better than going back to the old ways. The Bolsheviks were not, note I put there, not linked to the old system of government. They were at least a change. And why go back?
So there's another a massive consideration of why the Bolsheviks were strong, and primarily that is the leadership of Leon Trotsky. Now we know Trotsky was an old Menshevik who joined the Bolshevik Party before the October Revolution. He is utilized by Lenin to really turn the Red Army into an effective fighting force. He understands that the Red Army needs to do fundamental things and sets about changing it in many ways that help the Red Army ultimately win this war. Number one, he creates a single unified command structure in the Red Army so that they could act together and maximize resources. You don't have three generals like the Whites had, each competing for who was going to take the most land or who was going to be in charge after the war. You have a single unified command structure under Trotsky that can make decisions for the entire Red Army and move people around without having to worry about competing ideologies and so on and so forth. Number two, trained and organized. The army was trained and organized into a proper force capable of beating the whites. This included bringing back experienced officers from the old Tsar's army. These people were brought in to run the army and show the peasant revolutionaries who comprised the Red Army how to fight like proper soldiers. Interestingly enough, the Tsarist officers called bourgeois, how do you say that?
I don't think.
Whatever. They didn't necessarily come back out of the goodness of their heart. In fact, the Bolsheviks held their families hostage to ensure that they were loyal. Nevertheless, they were successful in training up the Red Army into an effective fighting force. Number three, they Bolsheviks, and particularly Trotsky, understood the need for and ensured that there were enough supplies of military hardware for the troops to keep fighting and win battles. So whereas the whites would sell their hardware off for personal profit, the Reds would ensure that everybody had enough bullets, enough guns, enough supplies to maintain a strong and effective force in the field. They also instill through discipline proper drill and proper procedure so that the peasant conscripts would not flee in battle. In fact, the discipline for the Red Army was very strict. If a soldier ran away, it would be the death penalty by firing squad for desertion. So there were penalties that provided a disincentive for running away in the middle of battles. Not to mention the fact that Trotsky is a good military leader. He moved troops around Russia to the various fronts. He visited battlefields. He gave inspiring speeches to his men. He knew the limits, and he left he knew his limits, and he left the tactics of how to fight the battles in those particular moments to the men who had been trained for. Trotsky organized the army, he inspired them, he moved around, he was a visible presence, and he knew when to say, somebody knows better than me, and allowed those people to make decisions which had successful results in many of the battles of the Russian Civil War. Lastly, he also used propaganda. In fact, Trotsky and the Reds would use propaganda much, much more than the whites. And this propaganda helped convince the Red soldiers to fight and convince them that their cause was just and their cause was right.
So the key thing Trotsky does is he turns the Red Army into a disciplined, effective fighting force. And much of this is backed up by the rise of the secret police. Now, to keep people in line, they need to be, at least in part, scared of you. And to keep workers working in the field under war communism, which we'll talk about next lesson, and keep peasants supplying grain in war communism, which we'll talk about next lesson, they need to fear you. The rise of an organization created under the December decrees, called the Cheka, is massive during the Civil War. Their job is to ensure loyalty to the regime through fear. They were integral to making sure that soldiers stayed in the front line. They roved around the back behind battles, seeing anyone who's walking backwards, even if wounded in many regards, and summarily executed them on the spot. If you know if you run away you're going to get killed for sure, you might as well start and fight the battle and at least win.
And take your chances.
It's better to take your chances. As well as that, once an area was captured by the Reds, they made sure that they stayed loyal. They would go house to house hunting any middle classes or anyone who's a bit suspicious, and they would execute them or make an example of them, particularly killing people who probably didn't really have anything to do with any crime, but just to send the message. And this is essential because, as you'll see, the whites, when they take land, very quickly have people sympathetic to the Reds, destroying railways, damaging property, and sort of sowing dissatisfaction amongst the white soldiers, whereas in the Red, once the Reds had taken some land as a result of the Cheka, it stayed red. There was no threat from behind, and the soldiers therefore could only really have to worry about fighting on the front line. It also massively helps war communism. Now, war communism we'll talk about much more in much more detail later, but on its own is a key reason the Bolsheviks win. War communism, very simply, is making sure there's enough stuff, so, weapons, steel, equipment, money, food for the army to win the war. Without this Cheka, they couldn't force people to work in how they will.
All told, 300,000 people are killed by the Cheka between 1918 and 1920. Without those amount of numbers, it doesn't take much to assume that in many ways, many people in the red zones of occupation during the Russian Civil War would have been affected by the actions of the secret police. And most certainly, the rumor or the knowledge of what would happen to you if you went against Trotsky and the Reds would have gotten out and ensured that people stayed loyal out of fear.
I think, yeah, and it's always key to making to focus on essays. The Cheka, those are 300,000 executions. They are arrested, tortured, brutalized, sent to gulags, which are like prison camps up in Siberia or in cold places. Many, many more than that. So it wasn't just 300,000 people were dealt with. They executed, well, let's say about a quarter, maybe a third at max. There's a lot more people who just got arrested and beaten. Many for very little reason at all, maybe just to send a message. But with all of this, That meant that the soldiers were far more likely to fight because they were scared. The lands they captured were more reliable. They wouldn't go back against them and they wouldn't attack the Red Army from behind after they'd moved on, and they would supply food. And the Reds were better supplied because the workers and the peasants worked hard, because they knew if they didn't, and if there was any suspicion that they were withholding grain, that the Cheka would be coming down and killing people, or at least sending them to a gulag to send a message.
The ultimate defeat of the whites comes in the end of 1920. One by one, the white armies are defeated. You get Kolchak, who's captured and shot in 1920. Denikin is pushed back to the point of irrelevance in the end of 1919, and he flees by November 1920. You have a massive bleeding of support from the average soldiers, while the Red Army becomes more effective, and the whites sort of start to collapse over a period of 1 year. The Greens are generally left alone until later, and the foreign powers, for the reasons discussed earlier, effectively give up on the whites.
The beautiful thing about the Greens is because they don't really attack, they stay in their areas. Trotsky made a decision to leave them till last to some extent. He would deal with the threat of people who are attacking him coming into Bolshevik territory, and they are the whites. Once those are dealt with, he will deal with the Greens. So these smaller groups, by 1919, 1920, he turns and deals with that. Most of those in the Caucasus and Ukraine are crushed. The Finnish and Polish managed to get independence because A, they fight a good fight, and it's quite hard for the Bolsheviks to really take them on, but mainly because they had a lot of international support. The French, as hopefully you should remember from year 9, wanted Poland to act as a barrier to Germany, so therefore supported the Polish. And the Finnish were seen as somewhat as more Western and more naturally European than anywhere else, and they were supported particularly by Britain and America. And so Trotsky decides, after crushing all the other Greens, to let these areas sort of have their independence, because Russia can't be in war forever, and certainly not against an angered international community.
So in summary, the Bolsheviks win the Civil War, and they win the Civil War primarily due to the weaknesses of the whites, their inability to unify their soldiers, and their inability to motivate and appeal to the majority of Russians. This meant that under Trotsky, a reformed and effective Red Army, with a strong central geographic position, with support from the masses and the overwhelming majority of the Russian population, could pick off the whites and then the Greens one by one by one. And over a period of approximately 3 years, between 1918 and 1921, the Civil War comes to an end.
Thank you very much.
So that's all we have for you today. We look forward to seeing you in class.
Enjoy.